Hi, everyone. It's good to see you virtually, kind of. This is your pre recorded lecture for Jacob Chapter 7 Ethical and Legal Issues in School Based Interventions. Just want to let you know I've got cats and a dog, so I'm so sorry. You might see them running around. There they go. So sorry about that. Without any further ado, let's go ahead and dive right on into Jacob Chapter 7. All right, so here I go. All right, folks. So one of the first few things that we think about when we talk about interventions is we always reference what's called this multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS system. And every time you hear this word MTSS or multi-tiered systems of support, I want you to think about this pyramid essentially. It's also known as response to intervention. It's just in recent years, it's been updated. The language has been updated to reference this pyramid as the MTSS system. As you will notice at the bottom of the pyramid, you will see that this is where the large bulk of time is spent in terms of giving interventions to about 80 to 90% of students. All right. Most most of the kiddos will get these types of interventions, and it's school wide, it's school based. This is for our students where they may need a little bit of extra help, but not that much extra help. Alrighties. Now, for students who maybe the green area isn't enough, we may have to give them a little bit more individualized or more smaller group based interventions, and this accounts for about 5 to 10% of the students that we work with. And then say if this doesn't work, then we move into even more intensive interventions, and that targets about 1 to 5% of the students that we work with. And you notice that there's some notes here in terms of at this level, tier 1, it's our universal intervention. Tier 2 is our students who are at risk. And then tier 3 is our students who have high needs. All right. So every time you think about interventions, reference this pyramid. In terms of behavioral interventions, this is where we plan a very systematized intervention. We're using a lot of learning principles, particularly operant techniques. So there's a stimulus, then it's either reinforced or disenforced, right? So we also model different theories in order to change the behavior. Um, and then we either work with the students directly or in collaboration with the teacher or even the parent. This is where we have to clarify the issue at hand. So we want to clarify the nature and the extent of the behavior. We want to look at any environmental factors associated with the problem behavior, and then also help in terms of selecting what are some of the behavioral goals we want to work on and develop. And then we also look into goal selection, where we develop and select goals that really enhance the long-term well-being of the child, and again, in their best interest. In terms of in the classroom, so IDIA requires that schools perform an assessment to determine the function of a problem behavior. So the function is, why is this behavior happening? So remember these acronyms SEAT. So it can be for a sensory function, it can be for an escape function, it can be for an attention function, or to access tangibles. All right. And sensory means it gives a student a sort of, it fulfills one of the five senses in terms of the satisfaction for a student. For students with on the autism spectrum, for instance, perhaps when they engage in repetitive behaviors, it's calming, it's soothing, right? In terms of escape, that just means that it is basically leaving or departing from an activity that is unpreferred. In terms of attention, you guessed it, attention is purely that. It's to gain the focus of others around them, around the student. And then tangibles, it can be access to a preferred item. So it can be a snack item, it can be a toy, an activity, a task, etc. Once the assessment is done, then the IEP team has to develop what's called a behavioral intervention plan, or a BIP. And there's different types of reinforcement strategies in terms of how we change this behavior. So either we can do, let's say, first then chart. So if the child does this, then they get this. So it's a type of reinforcement system that helps make sure that this child is behaving in a way that we want them to, a preferred behavior, an appropriate behavior. With social emotional interventions, whoopsies. Um, okay, so in terms of our responsibilities within the counseling relationship, again, keep in mind parent consent is required for especially school actions that can result in a intrusion on personal or family privacy. The only exception, again, is emergency counseling. Otherwise, best practices are that we inform parents um, uh, prior to starting any type of treatment. So it's really important to do the following when we're building rapport and establishing rapport with students in a counseling relationship. We want to have a very blunt and straightforward discussion about confidentiality and its limits before we start services. We want to have a good working relationship with students and their parents, depending on the case. We want to know state laws and regulations as well as school policies. We want to be familiar and acclimated with resources in the family and how to access these resources so that you can provide information to the parents. And then you also want to talk openly and honestly with the student or parent about any concerns you might have that may arise and any courses of potential action. There's some special informed consent issues that you want to keep in mind. In terms of self referrals, with younger children, it's really unlikely that you see self referrals, but they may self select to see you. All right. With middle school and high school students, they're more likely to seek out the school psychologist. Just be aware of the district's policy for providing counseling services and know any state law to determine the rights of minors in terms of seeking treatment without parent consent. There's also something to keep in mind in terms of the experimental methods. It's a very non-standard practice in the profession, so very rare that you run across experimental methods. This is essentially, this method hasn't been shown to be effective and it's rather new to the field. As practitioners, again, it's very rare that you will run across this, but just something to keep in mind. Treatment methods have to be indicated to the prospective recipient, so the student or the parent or the teacher. In terms of supervision and consultation, you want to make sure that you inform parents the cases that you'll be discussing with your supervisor, especially if you're in practicum or in internship. You want to make sure that you are being supervised, that parents are aware you have a supervisor who basically overlooks your tasks and your caseloads. In terms of working with our culturally diverse populations, keep in mind ethics again. Um, you must be aware of your own cultural heritage in terms of your gender, class, ethnic, racial identity, sexual orientation, and age, and how this really shapes your values, beliefs, assumptions, and biases, and how you relate to those who are different. You want to learn about your students or their parents' backgrounds, values, beliefs, and their worldview, and how those different factors influence their development and behavior. You want to show an understanding and respect for cultural and experiential differences when interacting with the student. As continuation of that, you want to seek knowledge of best practices in selecting, designing, and implementing treatment plans for diverse populations with learning or behavioral issues. You want to assist students and their parents to better understand the culture of the school and how to navigate resources and bureaucracies within the school if possible, and also help them understand community resources so that they can make informed choices relevant to schooling and their child's mental health. You want to self assess your own cultural competence and consider when you have any potential personal biases, or maybe there's limited information you may have about certain communities that may negatively impact your professional practice. And then once you are become aware of that and do that self assessment, adapt accordingly. In terms of duty to protect, in relation to child abuse, This goes back to the Adoption and Family Services Act of 1988, and it defines child maltreatment or abuse as the physical or mental injury, sexual abuse or exploitation, negligent treatment or maltreatment of a child by a person who is responsible for the child's welfare under circumstances which indicate that the child's health or welfare is harmed or threatened. Folks, as school psychologists, we are legally mandated to report all cases of suspected child abuse. All right? You cannot be held liable or sued for damages for filing a report of suspected abuse, as long as the report was made in good faith. All right? You have reasonable suspicions, and appropriate procedures under state law were followed. It's not necessary for you to be certain that the abuse took place, folks. Your job is not to investigate. Your job is to only report when there's reason to suspect abuse. There's penalties for not reporting, folks. It can be monetary fines or jail sentences. Be aware of signs of abuse, folks. Know the procedures for reporting and familiarizing yourself with those procedures, and how to handle different reports. It's the responsibility of the Child Protection Agency to confirm or disconfirm the existence of abuse. It's not your responsibility to investigate. In terms of threats, all educational practitioners and psychologists have the duty and moral obligation to take reasonable steps to protect students from foreseeable harm. We assist in the identification, evaluation, and determination of students who may be at risk for committing violent acts or targeted violence. A targeted violence is defined as a situation in which both the perpetrator and the target are identifiable before the violent attack. So if you know, okay, this student is about to commit a harm to this student, that means you have a duty, all right, to identify, evaluate, and determine the next courses of action and prevent harm. Reddy et al. Outlined a model for evaluating if a student is on path to targeted violence based on 3 principles. These principles are targeted violence is the result of an interaction among students, the situation, target, and the setting. There's no single type of student prone to such acts. The evaluators must make a distinction between a student who makes a threat versus poses a threat. There's a difference between a student who says they're going to do something bad versus actually engaging in something, a bad action, all right? Targeted violence is often the product of an understandable pattern of thinking and behavior. Some questions to consider, folks. Does the student have ideas about or plans for targeted violence? Has a student shown an interest in violence, acts of violence by others or weapons? Has a student engaged in any type of attack-related behaviors? Is a student cognitively and physically able to carry out a plan of violence? Has a student experienced a recent loss or loss of status, and this has led to feelings of desperation and despair? All of these questions will determine your next steps of action. In continuation of that, things to consider. Does this district have a crisis team? Are you part of this team? Does this district have a threat assessment protocol in writing that's used by everyone? How comfortable do you feel with the issue of threat assessment? Who can you or will you consult with when the issue arises at your school site? What are the resources in the community that you can refer parents to if their child is the threat or if their child is the one experiencing the threatening incident? In the Eisel case, the courts found the following, folks. This is in relation to threats to self or others. School counselors, and in essence, us school psychologists, we have a duty to use reasonable means to attempt to prevent a suicide when they are on notice of a child or adolescent suicidal intent. Again, we have a duty to intervene if we know that there's a suicide that can possibly take place. Schools must develop a clear suicide prevention policy and procedure to address issues. When the issue of suicide arises, the principal and a designated staff member should be alerted. The school psychologist could be one of the designated persons who have training in suicide prevention. The student should be assessed for lethality of suicidal ideation. So are they high risk, low risk, etc. Parents must be contacted in all cases if the risk is high or low. Let's go ahead and take a look at this video. And I want you to pay attention to this video because your Blackboard activity is going to be related to this.
Bombas socks are made to give. Are they stylish? Check. Comfortable? Very. And when you give a pair, Bombas gives a pair to some...
Skip ad.
Now, KOIN was the first report. This family has a history with Child Protective Services, both in the last few days.
I'm going to restart that video.
Now,
Alrighties.
Now, KOIN was the first report. This family has a history with Child Protective Services, both in the last few days and several years ago. The Clark County Sheriff was asked to go to the house in Woodland Monday to check on the 6 kids after CPS got an anonymous call. Deputies say CPS had already sent a caseworker to the house twice before to check on the family without getting anyone to come to the door. Then yesterday, the day after the crash, California authorities asked the sheriff to check the house again for the 3 missing kids. Deputies tell us everything appeared normal, but there was no sign of the children. And we also learned that in 2011, one of the women, Sarah Hart, was convicted of domestic assault against the couple's 6-year-old daughter. Court records from Minnesota say a teacher discovered bruises on the girl's back and stomach. Sarah said they've been having behavior issues with their daughter and admitted she let her anger get out of control and bent the child over the edge of a bathtub and spanked her.
And we're also talking with the couple who called Child Protective Services on the family, their neighbors up in Woodland. Our Cole Miller is here now with those details. And Cole, they were pretty worried right away after they saw CPS do that door knock.
Jennifer, that's exactly right. They tell me that all happened just on Friday, that they knew the family was home, but no one came to the door. No one answered. As they put it, this was yet another disturbing sign that something was very wrong. That couple, Bruce and Dana DeKalb, say the family moved in nearby back in May of last year. And from then until now, rarely saw them, but tell us they did see those children off and on, and it was almost always when they were in some kind of trouble. The DeKalbs described those children as thin and small given their ages, adding at one point one of the boys came by asking for food at first, just a few things, but it kept happening, even asking them to leave food by a nearby fence so that he could come and get it, saying his mother was withholding meals from him. Also, late last year, they say a little girl came over in the middle of the night covered in blackberry thistle, asking to be driven up to Seattle, that she did not want to go back home.
They portray this happy little family, and yet, the night before, their daughter's telling us, please, 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 begging us not to make her go back and that they are abusing her. And then Devontae coming over here and telling us that, he's being starved to death and they're mean and...
Just heartbreaking to hear that. Now, we also spoke with neighbors in West Lynn, where the family used to live. They tell us they really kept to themselves and lived a pretty private life. As for that Woodland couple, they also tell us they worry no one knew exactly what was going on because had someone known, something more probably would have been done. Now, it is worth mentioning I'll be talking to a family friend here shortly who says they were nothing short of amazing. We hope to have her story coming up a little later tonight. For now, we'll send it back to you.
And Cole, we are hearing from close friends of the family had nothing but positive things to say about the Hart family.
For that part of the story, we go to our Chris Holmstrom, who joins us live from their home in Woodland. Chris?
Yeah, Jennifer, I spoke with several family friends. They tell me they are heartbroken by what happened, but they wanted to share with me what kind of a family this was.
The kids were angels. They always beamed with smiles and...
Devastating news for loved ones of the Hart family. 2 mothers with 6 adopted children.
The Hart family, in my mind, are some of the most precious beings on the earth that we've met.
Max Ribner and Christina Pescatori are close family friends. All of them a big part of the local music community.
Anytime they would show up to an event, they would show up with just an overwhelming energy of love.
He goes on to say the family always stood out, whether it be family music festivals or rallies. In fact, in 2014, this picture went viral. It shows Devontae, one of the missing kids, giving a hug to a police officer. It was during protest over the shooting in Ferguson, Missouri.
The Hart family were such a great, and still are, a living legacy of bringing our people together and the importance of community and the importance of racial equality and the importance of freedom.
I asked them about visits from CPS, and they tell me there were no signs of child abuse, but that the kids faced challenges before they were adopted.
And they took day by day, hour to hour, moment to moment to help them rejuvenate and help teach them language and help teach them how to be here with community.
He goes on to say that their parents turned their life around, giving them the outlet of music.
I believe in joy. I believe in great things.
This, one of many songs Max and his band produced with the Hart family. He says this message fits them perfectly.
They really found the goodness in everybody. And I hope that we can all really learn a really beautiful lesson in that and carry that legacy on.
I believe we all have good hearts. I believe we're all one person.
So Chris also asked him if they knew why the Hart family was in California. They didn't know, but said that the family was always traveling. Now, we have continuing coverage on this. We have much more as the story unfolds. So you can always check KOIN.com or
All right, folks. So take a moment and just think about that case. If one of these children were a child that went to your school where you worked as a school psychologist, or you were the practicum student, an intern there, think about some of these signs and clues. What would be your next questions that you might have? What are some thoughts going through your mind? All right. Now, with some of the Hart children in your mind, let's say you work at that school. They're one of the students you work with. They show up to school. There's bruises all over their arms, hands, and neck. You meet with them to check in, and all they tell you is that they fell on the playground the other day. I want you, with all the thoughts regarding the Hart case and thinking about working with a student that shows up with bruises, what would you do? And I want you to type a 1-paragraph response onto Blackboard, right? Just a 1-paragraph response. All right. With that, that concludes our lecture with Jacob chapter 7. Okay, folks? All righties.